Today is May 23rd, 2005, and I am Jessica Clark, the Teresa Mack Germans from Russia History Fellow and the coordinator for the Germans from Russia Oral History Project. It is a pleasure to visit with Alice Buck in Streator, North Dakota. For the record, can you please state your name and maiden name and date and location of birth?
Alice Ruth Miller Buck. And I was born May 19th, 1932 in Streator, North Dakota.
Okay. We'll start off with some just introductory questions. You were born in Streator. Did your parents ever share any stories about your birth? Like, were you born in the home or the hospital?
Yes, I was born in, Grandma Sarah, she's a lady that helped women during childbirth. I was born in her home, and some friends of ours came over to see me, and their daughter, in fact, her name was Frida Wieland. She wanted to hold me, and when they handed her to me, she left her hands go, and if somebody wouldn't have caught me, I'd have fell on the floor. I'd have fallen on the floor. Sorry, my English isn't very good.
Oh, neither is mine, so I get corrected all the time. Frida, what did you say? Frida
Wieland?
Wieland? Thinking back, what is the earliest memory that you think you remember? The earliest thing you remember?
Oh, I have 3 little sisters that died at birth. And I remember seeing this one baby in her little casket. I remember that so well. And they're all 3 buried in Neudorf Cemetery, southwest of Gackle. And that I remember so well. I remember my mom crying and my dad crying. And I don't know if you want any more history on that, but the reason they were usually either stillborn or just lived for a couple of hours was because my mom had a deformed pelvic area and from a bad infection she had when she was a young girl. And her babies were either almost dead or dead by the time they were born. And luckily I have 1 sister and 1 brother that are alive, and me, myself. And our little brother that passed away is buried in California. We lived in California at the time my parents did.
How old was your brother when he passed away?
My little brother, he was stillborn.
He was stillborn.
Yeah, he was a very big baby. And after that, my mom had a hysterectomy, and she almost died. I remember my dad carrying her into the house. She couldn't walk, and sitting her in a chair. And at that time we were working, my parents were working the vineyards in California. And that's when my last brother was born, the last child of the family was born.
How old were you when your mom had hysterectomy?
I was about 5 years old.
And when the other babies passed away, do you remember?
Okay, our first sister passed away. She was the firstborn, Pauline. And then my sister Leona was born, and then I was born, and my brother Norman was born. We were all 3 alive. And then the other 2 sisters, Eileen and Janet, they passed away as infants too. And then Donald Kenneth is the one that's buried in California in Lockford Cemetery.
Do you remember that as being a scary experience for you since you were so young?
Yes, it was. I mean, we were looking forward to this little brother so bad. And when he passed away too, it was a sad time for our family.
Did they have a funeral service for their
Yes.
children? What was that? Can you describe that?
Okay, the only funeral service that I remember was at the funeral home of this little brother of ours. And the other sisters, I don't remember that we ever got to go to the funerals. I remember at the house, the preacher coming, and saying a few words. Of course, I was, about 4 years, 3, 4 years old, 4 years about, probably 4 and a half. And that's about all I remember of funerals.
about your parents, you had mentioned one of your grandmothers. Were you close to your grandparents on both sides?
I was very close, especially very close to my grandmother, Kamara.
Okay.
She was on my mother's mother. And they all practically raised me and my sister Leona. And because my mom had to work in the field, and so they had a lot of girls at home, and they usually took us up to Grandma Kamara's place.
So they lived relatively close then?
Well, they lived probably about 7 miles, something like that, from our place, from the home place. And my grandmother Miller lived about a mile west of our place. And so we'd walk over to her place when we wanted to, and we could walk back home again, get some goodies.
And your grandfathers, did you know your grandfathers well? Or?
Very well, yeah. In fact, when I went to high school, I stayed with my grandparents on my mother's side, the Kamras. And they lived in Streeter, and I went to high school in there, and that's where I stayed. So, and my grandparents on the Miller side moved to Gackle.
Okay.
And so once in a while, my sister and I would take the train. We called it the Galloping Goose, from Streeter to Gackle to visit my grandma Miller while we were still going to high school. That was fun.
You talked about, in your biography film, you mentioned that I think it's your grandmother, your mom's mother came over.
Kamara.
Kamara came
Yes.
over from Russia.
Yes.
And they landed on Ellis Island
Ellis.
on your mother's birthday.
Right.
Did your mother tell you anything else about?
Well, she was just 1 year old then.
Yeah.
So she doesn't know that much other than what she was told.
Mm-hmm.
And I know they came to Gackle by way of, what was it, train, I think it was. And some relatives by the name of Ginger, they sort of took them in until Grandpa bought a farm at about, I'd say about five miles from southwest of Gackle, and homesteaded there then. He bought it from a Mr. Bieber from Gackle. He bought some land, and that's where my mother was raised, and the whole family was raised. And then when my grandparents moved to Streeter, my mother's brother, Uncle John Kamara Jr., stayed on the farm, and he lived there until they moved to Jamestown. And now the farm is actually sitting empty, but the house is still there. There's a granary that's there, and a couple of granaries, and a garage. And by the way, our barn in this yard comes from that farm.
Really?
Yes.
We'll have to get a picture of that before we leave. And where did you say that the old farm homestead was located?
About 4 or 5 miles southwest of Gackle.
Okay. Mm-hmm. What were their occupations? Were both your grandparents farmers?
Yes. Mm-hmm. They raised cattle, sheep, and grandmother Kamara, she had her geese and her chickens. So did Grandma Miller, and turkeys and ducks, everything. Anything that would make a feather for feather tickings. They raised.
Be warm at night?
Yes.
First, looking at your mother's parents, can you describe your grandparents' characters? How would you describe them if you could?
Okay, my mother's mother, my grandmother Kamara, she was a very sweet lady. I mean, she was jolly. She was heavy, very heavy set, but a very jolly person. And what I remember so well is sitting in the evening in the living room when we were going to high school, Grandpa reading the Bible, Grandma sitting and crocheting, and Grandpa talking to her about the Bible. And then he'd also get a newspaper from Germany called the Staatsanzeiger, something like that. It meant, let me see, I think what it meant was something like a county gazette or something like that. I think that's what it means in German. Staatsanzeiger is what it was called. And he would read in German. I mean, it was printed all in German. He would read about things happening over there which weren't very good at that time, because during Hitler's rage there. And I remember how he would get upset about it because he had sisters over there yet. And we got letters from the sisters finally when they could write letters to us. They needed clothing and they needed food, and how Grandma would pack dry unperishables for them and clothing from ours, wherever she could get clothing. And they'd mail that over there to them. And some of the stories that they related with us were horrific. I mean, when you hear about people's eyes being gouged out and them being hanging on the tree to die, I mean, that was horrible. And one of his sisters said that they survived on dill pickles one winter. That's all they had. The other food was all taken away from them and everything. And I guess they mustn't have found these pickles that they make in big crocks. And this is what they survived. And she barely could stand anymore. She was so weak. Just
It's a hard time. Did they survive?
no, they eventually did die. I mean, they were up in age. And I think they both died before my grandma and grandpa died. So I says, when you hear those things, you just hope and pray that they aren't going to happen to us someday, because it must have been a horrible thing.
Unimaginable.
Unimaginable is right.
It was describing the characters of your grandparents.
My grandmother,
they were
Miller.
obviously generous and very family-oriented.
Very lovable, yes. And I remember Grandma making us a dough dish twice a week when we were going to high school. And all we'd get with that dough dish, and that's all we needed, was either strudels with fresh fruit to eat or canned fruit to eat, or we bought the pop in bottles at that time, orange pop, or what was the other thing? And she always had pickles on the table. And that was our meal. We had no meat with it, twice a week. This was our most favorite meal.
Anything with pickles. I love pickles. Turning to your grandparents on your dad's side, the Millers, how would you describe them?
Grandpa, I remember him giving me whisker rubs, and I just loved it.
What's that?
He would take me on his lap and rub his whiskers over my chin, my cheek. That was fun. And Grandma, we knew she had this cold medicine in her cupboard. And the only way you could have that is if you had a cold. So we'd always fake a cough. We'd fake a cough, so Grandma would go get us some Pinex. And she knew we were faking it, so she always had this silly smirk on her face. And but she'd go and get us about a half a teaspoon of Pinex, so we'd quit coughing. And another thing, Grandpa, the minute people would walk into his house, that included the children and all, he'd go downstairs, he'd get his bottle of wine, homemade wine, and he'd give us each a jigger of wine. And we got about a half a jigger, and the adults, of course, got a full jigger. This was his welcoming thing. I guess they were used to that. They made their homemade wine, they made their homemade beer, and even homemade root beer.
Did you help with that process as a kid?
No, I didn't. Not with them, but my parents did that too, up until I probably was through grade school, and then it sort of tapered out. Mom did make homemade wine until she passed away, and her wine was the best. It was better than any boughten wine you could buy, and it was just as clear as could be. And I never did learn the technique. I have made homemade wine, but I've never learned the technique. Never really, no. And of course, Grandma Miller, I can relate a story with Grandma. When we came back from California, we went to a rural school, and we stayed with my grandparents, Millers, until our farm was vacated again because we had renters on it. And we were told that if there's a storm brewing, and we were supposed to stay in school, and they'll come and get us. So this one day, the flakes were, beautiful little flakes were falling, and they were just falling straight down, but we thought, oh, this is a snowstorm. This is our chance to stay in school. So we got our lunch buckets out. We ate our little morsels that we had left at noon, and we put our jackets down in front of the big coal stove and bedded ourselves down, and all of a sudden we heard the jingling of harnesses. Looked out the window, and here my dad came with a wagon and horses to get us from school. And they said, well, why didn't you guys come home? Well, it's snowing outside. There's a storm outside. There is no storm outside. It's just snow. So he took us home. And of course, my sister Leona walked into the door first, and my mom was sitting on sort of a heater type thing. They had these water heaters at the time, radiators they called them.
Okay.
And she was sitting on one of those, and she says, Leona, she says, it was my sister, she says, come, you lay yourself across my lap here. And Leona just innocently laid herself across her lap, and she got a few whops with a razor strap. And I saw that, and I took off for the kitchen. And my mom says, Alice, don't you run away, you're next. So I got my whooping too, and my grandmother was sort of standing to the side and inside the door, and she was sort of smiling to herself. But I think that was a hard lesson learned.
And you guys were just trying to stay out of the snow.
I guess. And we usually had to walk to school.
How far was school from?
About 2.5 miles, something like that. I know, I don't think we'd let our kids do that nowadays. You know, you're always afraid of somebody picking them up or something. So at that time, there was no dangers like that.
Different times.
Really, really.
Real different times. Did you ever spend the night? I mean, you talked about in high school staying with your grandparents in Streeter.
Mm-hmm.
But did you ever, before then, like during grade school, did you ever spend the night at Grandma and Grandpa's?
Not really, because we had work to do. I mean, we were required to do our chores and our work at home. We had to work in the field alongside with Mom and Dad. And I remember shocking, and Dad would bind her, and me and my sister and brother and Mom would have to shock, and we'd try to keep up with the binder, but it didn't work once in a while. He got ahead of us. But I mean, we had work to do, so we couldn't go on vacation.
How old were you when you started helping with shocking and things on the farm?
I was 9 years old when I started pitching bundles. I was a big person, so I was probably considered older than 9. But when I started pitching bundles into the thrashing machine, and of course we did shocking before that. We could barely lift the shocks, and we had to shock. So I could say it was probably about 7 or 8.
Okay. And your brother, you have an older sister and a younger brother? Is that right?
Yes.
And were they always out there with you, or?
They were usually out there with us until my older sister developed hay fever so bad. And she'd get so sick from the dust and stuff. So she ended up being our cook and our washer, our clothes washer. And of course, the mom could stay out in the field, but my brother and I had to stay out there, or had to be out there all the time. I remember combining later on when we got the combines. I remember combining when I was still at home and having a few accidents with it.
Oh, what happened there?
Oh, we had some terrible high hills. And I remember it was a pull-type combine, and I remember jackknifing the tractor and the combine. The tractor started slipping. It was gravelly up the hill, and I couldn't hold I held the brakes, but it kept sliding backwards. And I didn't know, I was too dumb to know which way to turn the wheels on the tractor, so it wouldn't jackknife. And I had to call my dad.
Your dad coming.
He had to come and pull me up. So I went straight again. I stayed away from that hill after that.
Were your grandparents, either side, were both of them very religious?
They were both very religious, yes. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned being raised Lutheran.
They were both Lutheran, right. Mm-hmm. In fact, both of them were Neudorf Lutheran. That was a country church.
Okay.
And when my grandparents, well, when the Neudorf church was moved, discontinued in the country, then my grandparents, Millers, went to the Gackle Lutheran Church, and my Kammerer grandparents went to Streeter. Mm-hmm.
Thinking back, your grandparents, did they get along with each other? You know, your grandpa and Grandpa Miller, did they get along real well with each other?
They seem to.
Your other grandparents, did they get along real well with each other too?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that your grandparents had a strong influence on your life?
Very strong, very strong.
How so?
My grandmother Kamra taught me how to crochet. And of course, embroidery was done by my aunts, and we learned from them and from my mom.
Okay, you're talking about embroidery?
Yes. And I do that to this day. I mean, I can embroider. I never learned how to knit. And I've seen such beautiful knit works, but I just never learned that. But I do crocheting and embroidery. She also taught us how to do some cooking, some of the German stuff, and we appreciated that because my mom had to work so many times. I mean, out the field and everything, so she never had too much time to help us. She was always too tired, and I understand that now.
Now that you have experience with the farm.
Right.
Besides, well, actually, how many children did your grandma and Grandpa Miller have?
3 live ones, and
So your
1,
dad
2,
and then
3 that died.
okay. Your dad and who survived? Your dad and
My dad, his brother Pete,
okay.
Peter Miller Jr., and his sister Martha. In fact, she just passed away yesterday morning at 11 o'clock.
Oh.
So we'll be having a funeral on Friday.
How old
She was 90, I think it was 96, if I'm right.
A very long life.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Sorry to hear about that.
Yeah. And my Uncle Pete's wife now is in the hospital, and she's not doing too well, and she's going to be 97 in June.
Oh, well, they've lived very long lives.
Yes.
Something
Longer than my dad. My dad was 4 years shy of being 69. Yeah.
dead fairly young.
My mom was 83 when she passed away. So.
On your mom, how many brothers and sisters did she have?
She had 9 brothers and sisters.
And then, did they all survive their childhood and reach?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I shouldn't say that. They had 2. Okay, now there was 10 live ones with my mom.
Okay, 10.
But they also had 2 that died, little brothers, and 1 little sister that died in Russia.
So 13 children total.
Yeah. And those, the little girl, the daughter, was from my grandpa's first wife. He was married twice. His first wife passed away, and in fact, 2 of my mom's sisters are just half-sisters, the oldest ones. And my mom's the oldest of the second mother.
Okay.
So, and the little boys were from the second mother too, and they're buried in Neudorf Lutheran Cemetery too. That's where my little sisters are buried.
Were you close to your aunts and uncles?
Very close. Very close. In fact, I just came back from California. My youngest sister of my mother's had to have her legs amputated. One of them below the knee, and the other one they had to amputate 3 times because of infection and gangrene. And now she's got it amputated right above the knee.
What happened?
She had peripheral neuropathy. That was something that doesn't, disease that doesn't let your blood circulate through to your legs, or, no circulation in your legs. And she had so much pain, and it started on her toes. And her toes, she had so much trouble. She had sores on them and everything, and in so much pain that the doctor finally told her that you have to either live with the pain or else have them amputated. So that's what they did. And she wanted my sister and me to come out there and disperse of her household things, because she had to sell her house now, she said, because she needed the money for the nursing home. And the first week, a week after she had her first amputation, her daughter, Bernice, passed away. And she is a daughter that she had been taking care of all her life, plus a brother that is, well, he's as old as our second oldest, Robin. So he'd be almost 60 years old now. No, I'm wrong. Robin was born in 52. 56, so she'd be 50. He's 50. Okay. And he is, from birth on, he was not normal. He was, what would you call it? He had his cord wrapped around his neck, and by the time the doctors wouldn't do a cesarean, so by the time he was born, he was brain damaged. So she's been taking care of these children for 25 years all by herself since her husband died. She was mentally mentally retarded, and yet she was smart. I mean, she had a memory that went way back, but she could never learn different things, that like a normal person would. And they tried to get her into nursing home here in, not a nursing home, sorry, the Crippled Children's School in Jamestown. They lived in Jamestown at the time. And they said she wasn't bad enough to be taken in there. And at that time, we didn't have special education. So the child didn't have no way of getting educated. So they moved to Lodi, California. There they had a school where she attended until she was 18. And of course, by the time they moved out there, she was about 9 years old. So she didn't get all that much education. And at 18, she couldn't go to the school anymore. So they had to move to Sacramento, where they put her into a school that taught them how to take care of themselves. And all they did there was have her iron clothes. And she came home one day and she says, "Mom," she says, "I'm not going to iron another stitch of clothing." And I says, "Why? What's wrong?" She says, "That's all that'll make me do there is iron clothes." So Uncle Rudy and Aunt Ann said, well, for the money they were paying, they figured they could teach her more at home. But she developed leg problems and different things, so she never could, they had to keep her at home. They never could send her to a school, or she could never fare for herself. And she was some help to my Aunt Ann, because her little brother, Vernie, was completely bedridden. He was just a little crumpled, and I've got pictures I can show you of him. And anyhow, he is in a home now too. And anyhow, the daughter passed away, so like I said, an Aunt Ann had to sell her house then. And we went out there, my sister and I, and we took care of her belongings. And she wanted us to take it all home here to North Dakota. She wanted us to have it all. So we had to rent a truck. And we brought it back to North Dakota. And we've got it stored in Gackle for now. We don't know what we're going to do with it. And I talked to her last night on the phone, and she said that she was doing pretty good, that her legs are healed now. And she's going into a private home. And they're going to take care of her. So anyhow, we're thankful for that. But her son, Bernie, is going to be put into a nursing home. And
is she going to be able to see her son at all?
Well, it's going to be about 15 miles from Sacramento, where he'll be put into a home. And I don't know how often she'll get to see him, but hopefully they will take her there. Yeah, it's sad. I mean, that was her one worry. She always said, "I hope and pray that my 2 children will go before I will." Well, her oldest daughter, I guess she never counted on her going first. I said she'd have had arrangements for people taking care of her, but not for Vernie. And I guess her prayer was always hopefully that Vernie would go before she would. But it's the Lord's will. Have to do what He has in store for us.
Don't have much other options.
That's right.
You said that there's 10 children total on your mom's side.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the aunt's name in California?
My dad.
Your aunt's name in California?
Oh, Anna Hirsch.
Anna Hirsch. Mm-hmm. What are the other siblings' names?
Okay, the oldest sister was married to Fred Guthmiller, and the second oldest was married to Jacob Beer. Well, I guess now they say Beyer. It's spelled B-I-E-R. Okay. In German, we always called it Beer. Mm-hmm. And then there was my mom, Mrs. Joseph Miller, and then was Pauline, Mrs. Johnny Doctor, and Junior, and my Aunt Emma was married to a brother of Johnny's, Mrs. Louis Doctor, and Pauline, Teresa. She was married to a Johnny Cassman, and now she's married to a Ed Emick because my Uncle Johnny passed away. And then Anna was married to Rudy Hirsch, and have I got them all? And then there was John Jr., sons, and Gottlieb.
So they had a lot of daughters.
They had a lot of daughters, right.
As some of the other people have said, not a farmer's dream.
I sometimes think that's why Leroy and I ended up with 5 daughters and no sons.
You mentioned that 2 of them had married brothers. How did that happen? Was that just coincidence?
Well, you know how it is. You know, when there's sons in one family and daughters in another, and one of them starts dating one, and then they'll sort of be introduced to the other sisters and the brothers. So. That happened often. I know I have, my mother has 3 cousins that are married to 3 cousins of my dad.
Really?
And they all grew up in the Neudorf area. So that happened a lot.
Yes, I am finding that out. Did you have any other people around your grandparents' age that you were close to as a child? That you remember, like a neighbor or a family friend?
Boy. There was one family in California when we lived in California. They were my parents' age, though, by the name of Bills and Doris Spillaway. And she was sort of our mother when my mom was in the hospital. Okay. She would come and bring us food, you know, to my dad. My dad had to work in the vineyards. And of course, as kids, my sister was 6, I was 5. My brother was, about 3. So we needed care, you know. And she'd come and she'd bring us food, and she'd watch out for us. And my sister and I visited her when she's still alive. Her husband passed away, but she's still alive, and we just visited her when we were out there to see my Aunt Anna, and told her how grateful we were. Never had a chance. When we were little, we didn't know that much to say thank you. Appreciate things like that. So.
Looking back on life. You've talked about going out to California. You said in first grade you went to school out in California?
I started kindergarten. My sister was in first grade.
When did you move out to California?
My dad was looking for greener grass, I guess, for greener pastures, how they say it. And we lived out there for a little better than a year. And then he moved back. He didn't sell his farm or anything. I guess they thought they could move out there and make a bunch of money and come back and have some money to improve your, farm here. But I guess with the experience that my mom had out there, and they decided to just come back and stay on the farm.
How long did they stay out in California for?
Just a year, about a little better than a year, that's all.
So when they went out there, they kept their farm here then as well?
They kept the farm, and my Aunt Pauline and Uncle Johnny Doctor Jr., they lived on it. They had just gotten married, had no place to go to, so they stayed on the farm. And they milked our cows and sold the cream, and they never did put a crop out though, because they weren't here long enough really, and they had no machinery. So my folks came back again, and my husband and I did the same thing. In '55 we moved to California, to Sacramento, and my husband worked for Western Machine Company and I worked for Burkett and Richards Canning Company. And a little better than a year, we decided we wanted to go back to North Dakota. We came back to good old North Dakota.
You know, being from the Pacific Northwest and seeing California, I can kind of see why you'd want to come back to North Dakota. North Dakota is a very beautiful place. So, speaking of nature and environment, what was it like growing up on the prairie?
On the prairie.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you of an incident that we had. My mom, when we were too little to shock, we'd have to go out the field with my mom. And she was shocking in a rye field. And she was telling us of all these different flowers, like the little prairie roses, the petals from the prairie roses. And what else was it? Anyhow, she was telling us different things that we could eat if we ever were lost, to survive. And the rye that she was shocking had these ergot kernels in it. Well, in German they call them burnt kernels, but they're kernels that would pop out, dark kernels, and they'd be long, just like a little spike. And we asked her if we could eat them. And she says, oh, she says, I'm sure you could, she says. So we started eating some of those. And all of a sudden we broke out with sores in our legs, sores in our arms, and sores around our mouth. And she put salve on, and salve on, it didn't work, so they took us to a Grandma Mose in Gackle. She was a lady that browed. You heard about that? And they took her. She took us to her, and Grandma Mose took one look at us, and she says, "You," in German, she said, "You ate ergot kernels, didn't you?" And Mom says, "Yeah, I think they did when we were out shocking rye." She says, "You could have lost your limbs," she said in German. And I guess ergot was very poisonous. So she made a salve. She cut some hair out of the middle of our heads, and she burnt these hair. And then I remember she used goose fat, unsalted goose fat, and she mixed this with it. And what else she put in, I don't know. It was something in the liquid form, but I didn't know what it was. And she mixed this, and she said, you put this salve on, and you wrap your feet up real good so no dirt gets on them. And you know, that healed those sores. And then she braucht, and I don't know if you can't understand it when they brauch. Yeah. I mean, it's just something that it's almost as if they're talking in tongues or something. I mean, that's what it sounds like. But I remember that. And that Grandma Mose didn't only help with us kids. She helped with my oldest daughter, Pam. She was such a colicky baby. So she made a plaster out of a fried egg, and I don't know what else she put on it, but mustard was another thing. And she put it into a cloth, and she tied it on our daughter's tummy real tight, and she says, now you take her home, she says. Took her home the next day. Our daughter had no more colic. I says, those old women, they worked wonders. Yeah, she cried, and she cried, and she kept us awake, and she kept us awake, and now we had a beautiful, beautiful baby that didn't keep us awake anymore. Yeah.
Mom and Dad's dream.
Really. Anyhow, this ergot, I might elaborate on that. Back in World War II, the elevator, you could go to the elevator and get screenings from rye, and you pick these ergot kernels out and bring them back, and they paid you for them, and they were used as some medicinal product during the war.
Really?
And what they did with it, I don't know, but I know during the war they used that for some medicinal purpose. So that's how I earned my first permanent.
Really?
By picking ergot out of screenings, selling it.
Interesting. What did you find especially beautiful about the plains?
About the plains, I still think they're beautiful. Just walking out there, picking the flowers. And I remember walking out in the pasture, getting the cows. And we had an old cow by the name of Chessie that we could stop anywhere we wanted to and pet her. And my brother and I would always pretend we were we were so hungry. We were so hungry. So we'd stop old Chessie and we'd squirt milk in our mouth. That was our sustenance till we got home. And we had a creek out in our pasture that was just full of beautiful purple flowers. Don't know the name of them, but they grew about 2 feet tall. And they were just big clumps of purple flowers, beautiful flowers. I remember my mom digging some out and trying to plant them at home into her garden, but they never survived there. They're a wildflower and they came every year. I remember that so well. And another thing was roaming the tops of the hills to find the cactus dates. Have you ever seen these little round cactuses all full of little stickers? And then they get a flower on them, and later on sort of a berry. We called them a date.
Really?
And we could take a knife and pick them out and eat them.
Really? Huh.
And we still got some growing on top of the hill here.
Huh.
Take the grandkids out there every now and then, and I show them these things.
They'd have to really.
And another thing is we have a place about 2 miles east of here. It used to be called Bell's Ranch. And they have groves of trees down in their gullies. And that's where we went to pick choke cherries, and wild raspberries grew there. And what was the other one? Wild grapes. And June berries is another thing. We'd go down there, and this is where we'd go to on Sundays, to just go through the valley there, the trees and everything, climb up the sides, and this is our entertainment on Sundays, and we just enjoyed it. And now we can't go down there anymore because they have buffalo in there.
Oh.
And you shy away from buffalo.
Yeah, it can be a little intimidating.
It can be. But I remember this so well. And sometimes we take my dad's truck down there. My sister and I played accordion. And I'd play accordion, and the neighbor kids would dance on the back of the truck.
Oh, that's so much fun.
And that was another thing that we did.
What did you find unpleasant about the plains?
Unpleasant. One thing I really remember was if a prairie fire broke out, there was just no way of stopping it unless you had a plow that you could plow a fire break. And with the hills being as rocky where I grew up, it was pretty hard to plow a fire break because of the big rocks.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of the things that I always feared. And another thing is tornadoes. I mean, everybody's afraid of tornadoes. And we watched some of them when I was a little girl, especially the one that went through Lear, North Dakota. That's right south of here. And later on, my parents told us that it had taken, a man was out disking with his team of horses, and it took the team of horses and the disc up in the air and threw it down, killed the horses. And the person that was out there working, and it did a lot of damage, and it sucked water out of Beaver Lake and dumped it out on the land. I says, I've never heard of that before, but that's what had happened during that tornado. And about the same year, one went through Dawson, North Dakota, and did so much damage to the buildings there. And it showed where just half the houses were left. And so that's one of the things that I don't like about North Dakota. Well, of course, this isn't the only place. There's Kansas and where else that they have them. But the winters were hard. That I remember. And I remember in those days, my parents had to make hay out in the field, and there was no hay movers like we have nowadays. they had to take a team of horses and drive out into the field through the snow and pitch the hay onto a hay rack and bring it back home for the cattle. Sometimes, if you had time in the summertime, you could haul some home and put it into some kind of they built, in German you called it a Stroding. That's sort of a place that built with boards and stuff that they had hay in the middle and then had it closed off so the cattle couldn't eat it until come winter, and then they'd take some of the boards off and they could eat it, get their heads through and eat it. I also remember good times in the snow, especially when there were tall snowbanks and we could slide down, make ourselves some slides. But that's one of the things I love the prairies. I can't really say much bad about them.
What is your favorite season of the year?
Favorite season of the year? In the spring when the frogs start croaking and the flowers start popping out, the grass starts greening up. That's one of my favorite, and fall is the other one. Because the fall, the beautiful leaves on the colorful leaves on the trees, and the geese flying south. I mean, I will be sitting out in my garden in the field. I've got a garden just on the west side of our farm here. I plant all my big stuff out there, like my pumpkins and stuff. I like being out there in that garden when that noise of the geese comes through. They'll stop by the lake and you can hear them chattering, and I just love that. That's one of my favorites. In fact, that's where I go to relax, is out into my garden.
Sounds very peaceful.
It is.
Calming.
It is.
We've talked about your aunts and uncles briefly. Did they live relatively close to you, or
my uncle?
Were they really spaced out?
Okay, my Uncle Pete Miller. My grandparents' farm was in the middle. My Uncle Pete's Miller's farm was 1 mile west of their place, and my folks' farm was 1 mile east of my grandparents' place. So the brothers lived relatively close. Okay. The sister lived a few miles to the southeast of my grandparents' place. And one of my mom's sisters lived probably about 5 miles from our place, Mrs. Louis Doctor. And the rest of them all were relatively, too far to, like 20 miles. Some lived in Jamestown. One of my aunts moved out west early, right away after she was married. It was Teresa Cassman. But the rest of them all stayed around, like Medina, Jamestown, Cleveland, and that's about Streeter Gackle, something like that.
Mostly in North Dakota.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How much did you see your aunts and uncles? Did you see them quite often, or?
Well, in those days, there was a lot of them to visit, so you could only visit one at a time. So that's why we started having family gatherings. Oh. And right now we still have cousins gatherings. We have them at the different cousins' places, and they come from Wisconsin. We hadn't had the ones from out west come yet, but from Wisconsin and Minnesota and North Dakota. So we have them all get together at one place once a year. And that's how we keep in contact. That's probably the only visiting we have. And in those days when I was still at home, my parents would go visiting. We'd probably take off a Sunday afternoon and we'd go visit one at a time. So you couldn't do too much visiting in those days. Get them all, that often. Yeah. So I would say probably we visit them, each one probably once or twice a year. That's about it.
Okay. Did you have a favorite aunt or uncle when you were growing up?
Oh, I liked them all, really. My favorite really was my Aunt Anne, because she was so close to my sister, and she was only about 9 years older than we were. So we sort of felt almost like sisters. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, my Uncle Pete, he was close to us too. He lived close, and remember some real good things about him. My Uncle John was very good. Didn't get together too much with my Uncle Godlip. Aunt Emma Doctor, Mrs. Louis Doctor, she was another special lady. They were all so special. I just can't really, say that one was better than the other.
If you had to think about how they influenced your life, what would you say?
Well, like my Aunt Anne again, and she has influenced my life in a very Christian way. She's a very devout Christian, and I think she's really influenced my life a lot in that way. And the others, I really can't say. I mean, I wasn't that together with them that much.
Did you have a lot of cousins?
Oh, yes. I couldn't even tell you how many right now. I'd have to count them first. Yes, we had quite a few. I would.
Some close in age to you that you would.
Let me see. The ones that were close to our age, well, one of them, she's not alive anymore. Laverne Beer was her name. She was married to a David Janke from Jamestown. And then they were all sort of smaller than us. I've got some half cousins, you might say, on my Aunt Martha's side. My Aunt Martha's family, she married a man that had 6 children. And they, of course, had 4 children together, but they were all younger than me and my sister. Mm-hmm. But some of my Uncle Baltzer's children were our age. There was Elpin Kleingardner, Gordon Kleingardner. They were all boys. Irvin Kleingardner, Rupert Kleingardner, they were all sort of our age. I mean, probably a few years older or what, I mean. And of course, let me see from there was Mrs. Lyle Meeker, Viona Guthmiller, that was Uncle Fred's daughter, and his daughter Violet, and his son Irvin, they were our age.
Well, we just talked about cousins and going through the list of them. You had mentioned family gatherings. Did they start when you were a child, that you would have these family gatherings, or was that later on?
Not really. I guess I don't remember them doing many family gatherings. We started doing this before my dad passed away. And we'd have it in the park in Streeter. We'd have family gatherings there. And another time, then after my dad passed away, we'd have it in Gackle Park. And when my mom passed away, we decided to have it at either here on our farm or somebody else's place, my sister's place, my brother's place. And we'd have all these invite all these cousins, and they'd come and they'd bring some potluck, and we'd have a wonderful, wonderful visit together. Last year, the cousins, 2 of them came all the way from Wisconsin on motorcycles.
Oh, wow.
And our son-in-law, one of our son-in-laws from Bismarck, came with a motorcycle. So we had 3 cyclists here, which was unusual. I had to take pictures of that one. And one family from Wisconsin, the whole family came. I couldn't believe it. And we have a that's the only way us cousins can, keep in touch with each other. Yeah. And we're going to continue that until we can't anymore, I guess. And then we also have family gatherings, like the Miller family side gets together on New Year's evening. Every New Year's at the Gackle Senior Center. And there too, they come from my Uncle Pete's side, from my Aunt Martha's side, from my dad's side. And this was started by my grandmother Miller. And she always had it in her home. She had the whole crew in her home. She had a big house. But we decided that was getting too much to be in homes, so we have it at the senior center. And then for the Cumra side, we have this Cumra Cousins reunion. and that's the one that's always usually at our different places, different farms. And then we have just a plain old family gathering, like my family, Leroy and our kids. And that's usually at Christmas time here, Thanksgiving here, and Easter time here. They want to come home to the farm, and I says, as long as I can do it, this is what's going to happen. I fix the meat and the potatoes and bake the bread and make the pies, and they bring all the salads and sometimes a little extra dessert. And it works out just fine.
How big of a family does that bring into your house?
44.
Oh, wow.
If they all come. Sometimes, usually one of them has to work, can't come, or something's going on. But it's usually around that. That's about when the whole family's together, it's 44.
That's great. Back when you were a child, were there any big events like weddings or funerals or festivals that your extended family would get together for?
Yes. I mean, that's usually when the family would really get to see each other's, either at a funeral or at a wedding. We usually had all our daughters' weddings in the Streeter Hall.
Okay.
And sometimes we had a wedding dance afterwards. And what?
What is the wedding dance?
A wedding dance, when they have a band come in and they clear the floors and you can dance. They have the wedding march, and then later on they play their waltzes, their polkas, sometimes other music, and have a dance. And I remember my mother telling me a story that when their age or generation would have wedding dances, if no dishes were broken at the wedding dance to bring good luck, they'd throw dishes on the floor so the people would dance on them and break them to bring good luck. Now that was just a belief, I believe. Our relatives in South Dakota especially believed in that on my dad's side. So, and funerals, of course, after the service, usually the gathering in the church basement or something for lunch, and then visiting with the relatives and the friends. That's about all. And we never made a big deal about a funeral, you know. I mean, some people do have, or we have before, the night before the funeral, we have like a prayer service at the funeral home, and then you relate times, you know, good times and memories of the person that passed away. That's about all I can say about the funerals and weddings.
When you would go to visit family, your extended family, your aunts and uncles on Sundays, did you ever have to stay the night at their house, or would it just be an afternoon trip?
It would just be an afternoon trip, and luckily they were all close enough that we could, you know, you had to milk cows in the morning before you went to church. Well, after church then, you'd go to your place, and you never told them. You never had phones to tell them we're coming for dinner. You just arrived there, and they would put on a dinner for you, and then we'd stay the afternoon and we'd go home. They did it to my folks too.
You just hope you weren't going to the opposite place at the same time.
And you know, it's surprising how those people were always prepared, because it seems Sunday dinner was always chicken noodle soup. And of course, they had their canned meat and everything, and if you didn't have it ready, you went down, you got a jar of canned chicken meat, you put it on the stove, and with the broth you made the soup, and then you fried the chicken in a pan and add a few potatoes, and we probably got dinner sometimes at 1 o'clock or probably 1:30. But I mean, that didn't bother anybody, and people were always glad you came. You were always welcome. I remember that as being a tradition. And nowadays, if somebody would arrive just before dinner, you'd be a little upset, wouldn't you?
You'd be kind of shocked.
You could have called, couldn't you?
Yes.
Of course, you had to be home for chores again, so it was just an afternoon visit. You didn't dare stay overnight. May 23rd, 1907.
And where at?
He was born in America, down on the farm, my grandparents' farm.
And you said you said he was in his early 60s or mid 60s when he passed away?
He passed away in 1976.
1976.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe your dad? How would you describe his character?
He was a loving father. I know that. He would take me hunting with him. He loved hunting. He loved hunting. He loved trapping. He would give me a 410 shotgun, and I'd have to walk out ahead of him and chase the birds up. We didn't have a hunting dog at that time. Chase up the birds, and then he would come behind me and he'd shoot at the birds, and I'd get to shoot too. But I never knew if I hit one. I could hear the BBs falling around me, and he never put me in danger. I mean, he wouldn't put me in danger. He was that. I mean, he would shoot that he wouldn't. He knew that it wouldn't hit me. So I mean, I enjoyed doing that with him, or going trapping with him. The wintertime, he'd take us trapping muskrats, and me and my sister and brother, we'd go along. We'd be dressed in our heavy snow pants, and he'd always warn us, don't go too close to the piles, because it could be open around the piles and you'll break down. Well, sometimes just from playing, running around on the ice and you'd skid into one, and we did break down. And we had to walk home about a quarter of a mile with stiff, frozen snow pants. But we enjoyed going out muskrat hunting with him. Trapping, not hunting.
When you went hunting and your father shot behind you, did he let you take credit for shooting anything that fell? Or
you know that I never bothered to ask him. But I wondered many times if my shot got one of the pheasants or what.
How did your dad show affection? Was he an affectionate person?
Our parents never showed affection by hugging a lot. I guess their show of affection was just being there for you, doing things for you, and I don't know, just making sure that you're well taken care of. I mean, there was no hugging. There was no, like now you kiss them on the forehead or something. There was nothing like that. That was just something that wasn't ever done when I was growing up. And now we're huggers all the time and squeezers. And I remember my dad carrying me into the hospital in California, and that to me was really a big thing because I got carried. My sister and I both ended up with the measles just shortly after my mother got home from the hospital with having her hysterectomy. And I remember being carried in to the hospital by my dad. So to me, that was a real show of love.
Were you really close with your father?
Yes. In fact, our parents never showered us with a lot of toys or anything. I mean, when we got a doll at Christmas, we thought we had the world. They didn't have money to spend like people spend nowadays for their, toys for their children. So.
Would you say he was easy to talk with?
I think so.
You said he was a farmer. What type of farmer was he?
I think he was a good farmer because he was wealthy when he quit farming. I mean, he had a lot of money, and what you'd call a lot of money in those days. And then they moved into Streeter, and then he did carpentry work and masonry work for different people. And other than that, I mean, I can say he was a good farmer. He built that farm up. He had umpteen barns on there by the time, and they started out with one measly house and a barn, and that was it. That was all their buildings they had. And he built that farm up to a real nice farm.
When you went to California, what was it that was he farming out there as well?
Okay, he worked in the vineyards, and when he wasn't in when the grapes were all picked and there was no pruning or irrigating to be done, he worked in the winery. And he also, I don't know if you've ever, in those days, the almond trees and walnut trees, they'd take big bamboo sticks, they'd put tarps on the floor, and they'd hit them. I was with him, we were with him when he'd do this, hit the trees, and the almonds and the walnuts would fall on these tarps, and then they'd gather them up and sell them. And he did this for farmers too. And I remember him taking us with him because Mom wasn't, was in the hospital. So, and I started, well, when we went to school, we would come home, and of course there was nobody at home. When Mom was able to work again, she was gone picking strawberries. And we'd just be there by ourselves until they came home. We did some nasty things once in a while.
Like
Things.
what?
You really want to know?
Yeah.
We lived in a house that was called a tank house. It was just a square, tall building, 3-story building. The bottom story was one room. That was the living area. The second story was a bedroom, just a one-room bedroom, and you went upstairs to the bedroom on the outside and some steps. And way on top of this bedroom was another room with a big tank in it. And you had a well on the side and a pump that you could fill that tank with water, and that they used for irrigating. And you could also use it for eating or for use, for yourself. And when Dad was in the vineyard working, Mom was out picking strawberries, and us kids were at home. And of course, we wanted something to play with. And on the outside by this pump, there was a wheel that you turned to open the pump, so it would pump water to this tank. And my brother Norman pretended he was driving a car and accidentally turned this thing open. And all of a sudden, we saw the water coming out of the louvers up in the top. And we started hollering because we knew what was happening. We started hollering. My dad came rushing through the vineyard with his shovel and in his boots and thought somebody was kidnapping us or what. And here we had flooded the whole house. Our bedding was wet. Our kitchen, there was water in the kitchen. And Dad, all he did was shake his finger at us and says, "Just wait till Mama comes home tonight." And of course, when that poor Mama come home, she just sat down on the steps and she cried. She was so tired. She says, "You are sleeping in wet beds tonight." And she made us sleep in wet beds tonight. I'll never forget that as long as I live. And the next morning before she left, she had to hang all the bedding over the railing on the steps going up so it would drip out, and the mattresses and everything. Oh, that I'll never forget.
That had been a long night for you kids.
It was awful. Oh, when I think back, I says, "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry." But
Oh, when was your mom born?
in 1910,
Where was she
May
born?
May 20th, 1910. She was born in South Russia.
How old was she when she died? You said 80.
83, I believe, yeah.
How would you describe her character?
She was a very precious mom, very precious. I remember when us kids would be sick, when I was sick, I remember so well, she'd come upstairs and she'd sit on my bed. And when, we'd have a fever and we'd hallucinate. We'd pick spiders out of midair and whatever. And she'd come up there and she'd sit by our bed and she'd either read to us or she would write letters to her sisters out west. And I says, I can still feel the closeness of her. I said that she would do something like that, for me, sit on my bed while I was sick and do her things that she could have been doing downstairs. And she'd always make us a thing called, we wouldn't feel like eating, so she'd make us some stuff called brie. It was a milk product. She'd put milk in a pan, and she'd sweeten it with sugar and thicken it with a little cornstarch. And this is what she gave us. And that usually settled your stomach, and before long we were well again.
When you think about how you raised your children, do you see a lot of your mom and what you did with sitting on the beds of the children? And did you learn a lot of parenting from your mom, would you say?
Oh, I think we did. I remember doing that, things like that for my children. Probably not sitting on the bed so much as sitting in the rocker chair and holding them. In those days, I don't remember my mom ever having a rocking chair. I really don't.
What types of things did your parents raise you to consider important in life?
Do you want to give me that cookbook over there, beside there? I'm going to read you what we found in my mom's Bible.
Oh, great.
I'm sorry, Mom was 85 years old.
85.
I told you wrong. Okay, this is what she said, the recipe for life. She said, children, avoid all that is wrong and evil, and follow only, after that which is good and righteous. Stay together. Stick together with families, brothers, sisters, and friends. Then is life enjoyable. Do not neglect any of your children, and please do not shut one of them out of the family. Each child is a little different, and all are a gift of God to you. Take them to church and go to church with them. Only then can you expect them to be good and perfect. Always turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. Then the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. A token of love from your mother. I'm sorry.
No, it's a very beautiful,
Sorry.
beautiful, very beautiful word. Sounds like the importance of family came through strong from your parents.
It was. And she showed this in her home, because her walls and her chest of drawers and everything were setting full of pictures of the families.
Kind of something like your family tree that you've got going
Sort
on
of.
here. Sounds
Yeah.
like a very wise woman.
And we had to laugh. When we found the original, there's one thing that we left off, and that was the S off of the children, because she always says children's. And we thought that was so cute, but we didn't put it in. And then this is,
What is that?
that's a family cookbook that we made in memory of my mom and my dad.
Oh,
And anyhow, they've got mom's history, sort of, and dad's in here, and our first family picture
that is
that
really
we took.
neat.
And then we also put her little deal that we found from the Bible in here.
That's great, yeah. That's
And then these are all recipes of our family, of the Miller family.
That is a treasure.
I'm going to give you one before you leave.
That would be,
You can have one.
I would love that. That is great.
We'll be selling them at the Centennial too, so.
Okay. I'll let Michael know that he should get one for the collection.
Okay.
I'll actually make a little note of that.
I'll give him one too.
Okay. Who would you say was stricter, your mom or your dad?
You know, when my mom couldn't handle us, or if we did something wrong, all she'd have to say is, just wait, I'm going to tell Dad tonight. And we knew what we were getting. We were taken into the barn, And we were given a whipping. He wasn't that severe. I mean, they didn't whip us that we had strikes on ourselves or something, but he gave us a paddling.
Yeah.
But I guess Mom would really do most of this disciplining. It seemed Dad was always out in the field and not around when we needed the discipline.
What types of things would you get in trouble for doing?
Well, my brother and I would sneak tobacco. Dad had Bull Durham tobacco, and we would make ourselves cigarettes.
No.
And that probably wasn't so bad, but where we smoked them was up in the attic of the hay mound of the old sheep barn. And we'd sit up there and pretend we're gentlemen, you know, and talk to one another like farmers, and we'd smoke. And we could have lit that thing because there was hay up there. We could have lit that, and of course, when we got caught, well, Dad got the news about that one. And one time, I don't remember what I did wrong, but Mom reprimanded me for something. And I felt that I wasn't do that reprimand, so I told her I was going to run away from home. So I started walking out the back road, going up the hill, headed for the highway, and I figured Mom would really feel sorry for me, you know, and she would come running after me. And all she says, Alice, you come back here right now, or I am going to give you a licking, she says. And you know, all the while I was walking away, I was thinking, oh, Mom, please come and get me. Please come and get me. Because I didn't really want to go. But I was just going to make her really feel bad because she had reprimanded me. And I was so glad when she told me, Alice, you get back here or you're going to get a licking.
The fear of her not saying something.
Really. I says, isn't that something? I mean.
Any excuse for me to turn around right now would be great.
Really. Oh, yes.
How would you say your parents, besides your mom's words on the importance of family, how would you say they influenced you as a person?
I think she had a very good influence on us. Very good. And I'm thankful for that. I really am.
When you think about your parents as a couple, how was their relationship with each other?
Oh, I remember them having some squabbles. Usually it was something like during thrashing time, my dad had a thrashing machine, owned a thrashing machine. And, you know, school started before thrashing even started. And many times he'd keep my brother Norman out to drive grain wagons back and forth. And I remember them having an argument about that. She didn't think that was right. There was other people that could do that. We were supposed to go to school, but being he was the son, he figured he had to, you know, there was difference of opinion there with the two.
Did they ever keep you home to do farm work?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. In fact, well, not from grade school, but I remember after I was through grade school, my dad says, well, my sister started high school and I wanted to too. And he says, Alice, he says, why don't you stay home and be my cowboy? So I stayed home a year. And so I missed out. I mean, I graduated 1 year later, but the next year I did go to high school. But I did stay at home. I helped him combine and helped him do fall work.
What about your brother? Did he go on to high school as well?
He never went to high school.
Did he finish grade school?
Yeah.
When you think about your parents, what were the best things about their relationship with each other? What was the best thing about it?
Well, I think they had a good working relationship, one thing. I remember my mom was in the hospital. I don't remember what she was in the hospital for that time. But when she came home, I remember Dad must have missed her an awful lot because that evening, us kids, we went upstairs and we were going to come down for a little snack or something, and we noticed Mom and Dad sitting on the Davenport and hugging. Sort of sitting there just like little, like boyfriend and girlfriend. I says, to us, that meant a lot. That meant that they loved each other. So.
When your parents weren't working, what types of things did they do?
You know, actually, when they weren't working in the field, they were doing stuff in the yard, you know, to get the yard cleaned up, or many times there was a building project that was going on at the farm. And as far as vacation, they never took no vacation, really. Didn't even go to Medora. Well, I don't think Medora was in existence at that time. The beautiful Medora.
Yes.
All I remember is when 4th of July came, we worked so hard because we wanted to go to the 4th of July celebration. And usually there was some kind of a project that we had to finish before we got to go. So those are probably the only time that my folks took off, was for like 4th of July celebration, Memorial Day.
Where did you go for 4th of July? Did you go to Streeter or did you go up to Jamestown?
You know, no. Our little hometowns here, they usually had a 4th of July celebration. I put on a big celebration. And nowadays they don't do that anymore for some reason. I always say that little town of Fredonia puts Gackle and Streeter to shame as far as celebrations is concerned. They're such a small town, and they usually have a celebration every year. And Streeter and Gackle now, the centennial celebrations is about all they're going to have. Well, Gackle has a town and country day every fall. Okay. And other than that, Streeter doesn't have any kind of
so on the
celebrations.
Sign, Streeter says like the annual buffalo feed.
Oh, that's right. That could be something, but that's just more or less an evening thing, okay. You know. But I shouldn't say that. For the community, it's a 3-day thing. Okay. It's getting all the food prepared, and serving it, and then getting everything taken down again. Okay. You know, and undone. So. Yes, they've been very successful with that.
When do they do that? What time of
usually the last Friday in October is usually the celebration. You'll have to come to it sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to. Oh. I like buffalo meat.
You get fed royally. All you can eat. There's buffalo meat, there's mashed potatoes and gravy, and there's soup or juice that they make out of the bone meat. They cook them up and make soup, make vegetable soup from it. And then they have the marinated onions, the corn, marinated onions. Let me see, the relish tray, the relish, cranberry relish. There's more. And then you get a dessert. And it's all you can eat. It is so good.
How long have they been doing that?
40-some years. 40-some years. I wouldn't say 40 what, but it's 40-some years already. Could be probably about the 45th, 46th probably. So it's been quite a project.
Sounds like a nice tradition.
Yeah.
Who made the rules in your family? Your mom and your dad, or both?
Who what?
Made the rules.
Made the rules.
Household rules.
Actually, I don't think there were no rules. You just knew what you dared to do and what you didn't dare to do, and
your expectations were just known.
Yeah.
Tell me about your brother and your sister. What were they like?
Well, my brother Norman. I remember him. He's just a little ornery guy. He would, when he was supposed to have or be reprimanded by my dad, he would take off running. He knew my dad couldn't outrun him. And he was only, about 4.5 years old, something like that, 5 years old. He would outrun my dad. Like I said, he and I got into mischief with smoking. And, I don't know what else. I remember in the wintertime, we'd make a pathway in the snow, and we'd get tires. We'd make paths and that would represent roads to our farms and whatever. And we'd have old tires, car tires, that we'd roll along these roads. We'd drive to one another's place and we'd talk like farmers do to one another. It reminds me of that picture of the two little boys and talking to each other in overalls on a picture, and the caption says something about what, or have you been farming lately, or something like that.
I think I've seen something, yeah.
That's about what that reminded me of. But we had fun doing this, and my sister and I, well, we get into little squabbles with one another. I remember one morning we were supposed to get ready to go to school, and I was ready, and Leona wanted me to do something. I don't remember what it was, and she says, Alice, you do that. I says, no, I says, I'm not gonna. She says, if you don't do it, I'm gonna take this raw egg and throw it at you. And I says, I dare you to, and she did. And she had to stay home and clean the egg mess up, and I got to go to school. I took off running to school.
Did it hit you though and make a mess on you, or just on the floor?
No, it hit the floor. It was her mess. Oh, and
How much older was she than you?
10 and a half months. In fact, we're the same age right now.
Really?
Since May 19th. From May 19th to July 5th, we're the same age. My folks had
And how much younger is
children
your
real
brother?
close. How much what?
Younger is your brother?
2 years.
2 years.
So we're not that far apart. And my oldest sister that passed away was only about 11 months older than my sister Leona.
So
Very close.
were your sister and brother also born in Streeter?
Leona was born in my grandparents' Cumra's place.
Okay.
And Norman, I don't know where he was born. I really don't.
Do you have any interesting stories about their births, and were they?
Well, all I remember is my sister Leona. Dr. Merkel was his name, from Gackle. He was her doctor. And by the time she was born, her face was so misshaped that they couldn't hardly tell what she looked like. I mean, it was, and then they always said, told us kids that the doctor had, in those days they didn't tell you that children were born from the mother. They always said the doctor brought them, or the stork brought them. Well, Dr. Merkel brought her in a suitcase, and he had her squished in the suitcase, is what they told us. I believed it then, but I don't believe it now. And Norman, I never heard anything from Mom or my grandparents about Norman's birth. I just don't know. And mine, of course, I told you that one. Them just about dropping me.
Was there a lot of competition? Since you guys were so close in age, did you guys compete for a lot of the things like attention or races?
Well, in running, I would always beat my sister Leona. I remember walking home from high school for dinner. In those days you didn't take your lunch to school, and you weren't served lunch in school. So you walked home to my grandparents' place for dinner when we lived in Streeter, when we went to high school. And I'd always say, when I was about a block away from Grandma's house, I'd say, Leona, I'll race you. And we'd both take off running, and of course my sister Leona would stumble and stub her toe, or one time she sprained her wrist by running and she fell. So I'd usually beat her running, that I know. She had a hard time spelling. Was it spelling? In spelling, I would usually beat her in spelling. Other than that, she was a much better seamstress than I was. She'd take old clothes and she'd renovate them and make them into doll clothes. That's something I could never do. And she did this when she was, I'd say probably before she went to high school. She would do this. She'd have to stay at home and fix the meals for us, when we were out in the field working. And she'd do this in her pastime when she was done with her chores. So.
About how old was she when she developed hay fever that she had to stop helping out?
I'd say she was probably about 9 years old when she started.
Stay back at that time.
I had to go out when thrashing time and had to either haul grain home or pitch bundles into the thrashing machine. And she could never stand, the dust or anything. So that's another thing I remember is going up into those bins. When the grain was being augered in and pushing it around so a person could get more in and almost choking, and then there was usually a window open and we'd run up to the window and get a few breaths of fresh air and go right back into the dust again. In those days you didn't have nothing to cover your mouth or your nose with. I couldn't take it now anymore, that's for sure.
Sounds like I'd be sneezing a lot. So then when she, at 9, how old were you when you guys started cooking, you and your sister?
You know that I never got a chance to cook when I was home? Because my sister did the cooking. I started learning how to cook when I got married. And of course, when you interview Leroy, he'll probably tell you how many times I burned something.
Yes, my husband could share a few on that as well.
Oh.
So, did you learn where did you learn how to make the traditional German dishes?
From my mom and my grandmother, Kamera. We were with her, I guess, more than with Grandma Miller after she had moved. So by then we were old enough to learn how to do these German dishes. In fact, I try to teach them to my granddaughters now. I had my little granddaughter Morgan help me with making strudels the other day. We had some people here from Montana and he wanted a strudel dinner, so I made him a strudel dinner and she wanted to help so bad. So I just gave her a patty and I let her roll it out herself and oil it, and she stretched it and she made her own strudels. She was the first kindergarten this year.
Oh, that's precious.
I told her, I says, you're going to have to keep the tradition going. You're going to have to be the strudel maker.
When you lived in Streeter, can you describe the house? What was the house like?
The house in Streeter, my grandparents.
That you grew up in.
That I grew up, well, the house.
I guess it's not in Streeter, but
it's the farmhouse. Okay, the first house we grew up in, let me see, we were about, what, 7 years old when my folks, well, where I was born in was a 2-room house with a little shack on the front, sort of an entry. And the one room was the living room and the bedroom together, and the other house was the kitchen and dining area. And the little porch, of course, that's where my mom had her washing machine and where she did her washing in, and we come in with the dirty clothes, And then when we moved out west, that house was still there when we come back from out west. My dad bought a house, a used home, older home, and moved it on the farm that had 2 rooms upstairs and a kitchen downstairs and a living room and a bedroom downstairs. And they built a porch on the front then. And it was an enclosed porch. And then later on there was a closet in the kitchen area that sort of a pantry type thing, that they made into a bathroom later on when they got running water. And other than that, it was set on a basement. And we had a room down the basement. We had rooms down the basement, a coal bin for the coal for the coal stove or the furnace. And my dad also had an electric. In those days, you made your own electricity with big batteries, and then you charged these batteries with a wind charger. And that was your electricity in your house. And that was probably the only place we had it. We didn't have it in the barn at that time until Chem Electric come out with rural electric. And Then she had a room for her canned stuff and where the furnace set, and that was about it.
Where did you all sleep? Like your
Okay, we had 2 rooms upstairs. My sister and I had to sleep together in one bed, and my brother had the other room. So that worked out okay. And the little attics were our storage rooms. You know, we had little attics off the, you know, when they off to the side where the house was, it was too steep. The roof of the house that they sort of had to cut it off, and then there was usually crawl space where they put clothes in and that packed them away for the summer or the winter because you didn't have the closets. You just had to hang them up on hangers and have them in drawers of vanities or chest of drawers. So
was it fairly cold upstairs in the winter?
no, they had it heated. They had the heating rooted up there, so we had a warm house. Yeah, I know some people had said they slept with frost on the walls.
I have one person that said it was so cold that once you got out of that feather tick, you went all the way downstairs to get dressed.
Yeah.
What was the furniture like? If you remember the furniture, what was the furniture like in your house?
Okay, the first furniture my parents had was just a round claw table with chairs. They had a cook stove that you fueled with cow patties, and if you know what that is, we had to go out and dry them too. That's another thing I remember of the prairie, drying cow patties, and wood and coal, and that's what she cooked on. And she had an oven in it, it baked, and it had a big tank on the back that was a water reservoir. That's where we got our hot water out of. And she had a kerosene stove too, and a cupboard, just a standalone cupboard where she had her dishes in, and a table and chair, as I said. And then they usually had one of these little bread boxes. It stood about 2 feet tall, and you opened it. You could open a door and you store your bread in there. And this is now in the 2-room house, and all we had in the living room was a standalone clothes closet, one of those tall ones that went from the floor to the ceiling. I don't even know what they call them anymore. And 2 beds. And my sister and my brother and I, up until we were 6 years old, we slept in the same bed. And they had their bed in the same room. And we had an organ, that's where I learned how to play by ear on the organ, and a china closet. And that was it. We had no Davenports, probably a chair here and there. No Davenports of any kind. When we had company in that little house, the company always sat in the kitchen and visited. We got the couple of chairs out of the living room, and that's where they sat and visited. And us kids were in the other room jumping on the beds.
Roughhousing in the bedrooms?
Yeah.
How often did you move? You moved once from Streeter to California, and then from California back to
North Dakota.
Back to North Dakota, and is that it?
No, well, yeah, to North Dakota, yeah. I mean, they moved from the farm into Streeter,
okay,
and then back to the farm, and then back to Streeter again. So, I mean, was their moves.
Okay.
Leroy and I moved, I think, 7 or 8 times in our lifetime.
Did you have any nicknames? Did your family use any nicknames when you were growing up?
I had several of them. I was called Muttley, and I'm not Magdalena. That's a German name for Magdalena.
Okay.
Muttley. If you had an aunt by the name of Magdalena, they called her Muttley Boss. My grandma Miller's name was Muttley, but they called me Muttley, so they must have thought I looked like her or something. And or they called me LSMFT. Lucky Strike means fine tobacco. And they called me Speed because I could run like a deer, they said. And my brother's name was Whitey because he had totally white hair, and he doesn't have a white hair in his, well, he probably has white hair in his hair now, but not his baby hair. But his baby hair were white, and they'd either call him Whitey or Little Joe. And my sister Leona, boy, I don't remember that they had a nickname for her. I don't remember that they did.
What language did you primarily speak at home?
My folks spoke German with us. In fact, my sister and I went to start at school in California talking German, and we had a very hard time until we finally learned the English language from hearing it from other people. But primarily my folks taught us German first, and then later on English. I know there was sometimes in school when we'd come out with something German, we got reprimanded for that.
How would they discipline you in school?
They would tell you to stand in the corner. I mean, we weren't supposed to speak German. We were supposed to speak strictly English. And of course, our English was very limited. So sometimes a German word came out.
Did you speak German at recess or noon hour? Or
Well, probably if we weren't caught by the teacher.
Caught by the
The teacher was pretty strict.
Were you allowed to, once you started learning English, were you allowed to speak English at home or?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. My parents knew how to speak English, too. And in fact, my grandmother Miller told me when I was confirmed, she says, if you don't say a German Bible verse for your confirmation, you are not going to get anything, any gift, you know. They usually got a gift when you got confirmed. So I made sure I said a German, had a German verse, plus we did sing a German song.
When you went
We
through
were
confirmation,
confirmed.
was that in German or did you go through it in English?
In English, in
And
English.
so then you just opted to do a German.
Yes.
Okay. You've talked about your sister Leona doing the cooking and stuff. What other, who else helped around the house?
Well, we had to do some work once in a while, but Leona did the brunt of it because she just couldn't be outside, you know, in the field with us. And usually Saturdays was usually cleanup day, and usually she ended up with the most of it, and my mom, you know, scrubbing the floors and everything. In those days, you didn't have no carpeting anywhere. It was either scatter rugs on vinyl, you know, flooring, and so there was a lot of scrubbing to do and mopping to do, and she usually got stuck with most of that.
Did your father ever help with household tasks?
No. That was a woman's work, even though the woman had to be out in the field with him.
You know how often I'm finding this out?
Oh, really?
It's very, very common.
Oh, man.
What chores did you enjoy as a child?
Chores I enjoyed as a child.
Or didn't mind?
Oh,
Enjoyed.
I loved slopping the pigs.
Oh.
Because we made some kind of a deal in a big barrel, some food for them that was you put grain in there and then you poured water in there and then the leftover milk, instead of spilling it, you know, after you separate it, you poured it into this barrel and it made something called slop. And it just like got cottage cheesy on top, and the hogs just loved that. And that's what I like giving them. And little chickens. Oh, when Mom had little chickens, I loved feeding them, being out there with the little chickens, or little ducks and geese. Of course, Mom did hatch a lot of her own in a little incubator. And some places we had little huts out there that we'd set clucks in with eggs, and they'd hatch their own little chickens. And that's the way she raised them until one year that I remember that she had I don't know what you'd call it. It was just a homemade contraption where she went and bought some little chickens. And, oh, I know how to say it in German, but I don't know how to say it in English.
You could say it in German.
It was some kind of a heater that they put them into. It was built about 6 feet long, and it was on sticks, and then it had sort of a chimney in the inside, and underneath that you put a kerosene lamp, and you lit it, and that heated that place, and that's where the little chickens grew until they started getting little tiny feathers on their wings, and then it was time to put them out into the brooder house.
Oh,
That's what it was called, a brooder.
which chores did you dislike doing?
Just like milking. The only thing I liked about milk is when the cats were roaming the aisles to squirt at the cats. That's other than that, I hated milking.
Differences between summer and winter work. What were some of the differences between your summer chores and winter chores?
Well, winter chores, we usually didn't get to do any chores until we come home from school in the evening, and then it was like helping to feed calves. And that was about it in the winter. In the summertime, it was helping Mom feed the chickens and like slopping the hogs and stuff like that. In the wintertime, you couldn't have that slop outside for the hogs because it would freeze. So they just got the fresh milk, and put grain in their troughs and then pour the milk on it. They'd eat that, and then we'd have to pick corn and have it in a corn crib, and that's what we fed them, through corn cobs out to them. That we had to do too. Us kids had to do that.
Did you ever have to go help out some neighbors with some farm chores? Or?
We used to have corn husking bees. We'd get together and we'd on somebody's hay mound, and we'd have the picked corn, and we'd husk it. We'd have to take the cob in our hands. First of all, we had to take the husks off, and then we'd have to twist it like this, and it sort of, you rubbed the kernels off the. We never had a corn cobber like that before. So we had to do it by hand, and we'd get together, the neighbors would get together and do that one house and then go to the next house.